The river Tigris ran black with ink and red with blood. This is not a metaphor. It is the literal, historical account of the year 1258, a year that marked the psychological nadir of the civilized world. The ink came from the grand libraries of Baghdad, the house of wisdom, thrown into the water by men who had no use for philosophy or mathematics. The blood came from the city's inhabitants, hundreds of thousands of them, slaughtered in a display of violence so absolute that it altered the climate of global politics for centuries. The perpetrators were the Mongols, the unstoppable, thundering horde that had swept down from the steppes to dismantle empires with the ease of a child knocking over toy soldiers. By the mid-13th century, the Mongol war machine was not just an army, it was a force of nature, viewed by those in its path not as a military challenge, but as the inevitable judgment of God. They had crushed China. They had obliterated the Khwarezmian Empire. They had shattered the Kievan Rus and brought the knights of Europe to their knees at Legnica and Mohi. And now, under the command of Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis, they had decapitated the Islamic Caliphate. The world was shrinking, and the shadow of the horse archer was swallowing the light. To the surviving powers of the Middle East and North Africa, the message was clear: surrender and live as a vassal, or resist and be erased from history. There was no third option. There was no weapon, no wall, and no strategy that had ever successfully halted a full-scale Mongol invasion in the open field. But history is often hinged on the smallest of details, the turning of a screw or the ignition of a spark. As the Mongol Tumans turned their gaze toward Egypt, the gateway to Africa and the last bastion of Islamic military power, they believed they were marching toward another inevitable conquest. They were commanded by Kitbuka, a general of supreme confidence, leading a force of nearly 30,000 hardened veterans. They expected fear. They expected capitulation. What they did not expect, and what they could not possibly have foreseen, was that they were walking directly into the testing ground of a new era of warfare. They were about to encounter a resistance that utilized a technology so foreign, so terrifying, and so radically applied that it would dismantle the Mongol psychological advantage in a matter of hours. To understand the magnitude of this event, we must first look at the seemingly invincible engine of the Mongol army. Their dominance was not merely a result of numbers, it was a triumph of discipline and mobility. The Mongol horse archer was the fighter jet of the medieval world. Capable of shooting with lethal accuracy while riding at a full gallop, they could encircle slower armies, peppering them with arrows from a distance, retreating before the enemy could strike back, and then swarming in for the kill once the formations broke. They weaponized terror, they weaponized speed. Their favorite tactic was the feigned retreat, pretending to flee in panic to draw the enemy out of position, only to turn and slaughter them. It was a trick they had played on the world for 50 years, and the world kept falling for it. Standing against this tide were the Mamluks of Egypt. The Mamluks were a unique phenomenon in history. They were a warrior caste composed of slave soldiers, mostly of Turkic and Circassian origin, purchased as boys and trained their entire lives in the arts of war. Unlike the conscript armies of Europe or the decaying levies of the Caliphate, the Mamluks were professionals. They were essentially the special forces of the 13th century. They knew the Mongol tactics intimately because many of them shared the same steppe heritage. They rode the same horses. They used similar recurve bows. But the Mamluk Sultan Qutuz and his brilliant general Baybars knew that matching the Mongols skill for skill was a gamble. To destroy the invincibility of the horde, they needed an edge. They needed something that could break the coherence of the Mongol cavalry charge. This brings us to the innovation that would define the coming confrontation. While gunpowder had been known in China for some time, primarily used for fireworks and rudimentary incendiaries, its application as a tactical field weapon was still in its infancy. The formula had traveled along the Silk Road, finding its way into the hands of Arab alchemists who began to refine the mixture of sulfur, charcoal, and saltpeter. They sought not just to burn, but to explode. In the secret armories of Cairo, military engineers were crafting a device that was the great-grandfather of the modern firearm. These were not the massive siege cannons that would later knock down the walls of Constantinople. These were portable, handheld cannons, known as the midfa. The midfa was a terrifying concept for the time. It consisted of a tube, often reinforced with iron or wood, loaded with a volatile gunpowder mixture and shrapnel or an arrow-like projectile. When ignited, it didn't just project a missile, it produced a thunderous clap of noise and a blinding flash of fire. In an age of swords and silent arrows, the psychological impact of a weapon that mimicked the sound of a thunderstorm cannot be overstated. But the genius of the Mamluk strategy was not in the lethality of the bullet, but in the biology of the horse. The Mongol dominance relied entirely on the horse. Their mounts were sturdy, disciplined, and trained to endure the screams of men and the clash of steel. But they were animals. They had never encountered artificial thunder. They had never seen fire leaping from the hands of infantrymen. Kutuz and Baibars realized that if they could disrupt the horses, the riders would become vulnerable. If they could incite panic in the mounts, the famed Mongol formation, the cornerstone of their invincibility, would dissolve into chaos. The stage for this collision was a place called Ain Jalut, the Spring of Goliath, located in the Jezreel Valley of Galilee. It was September of 1260. The summer heat still baked the valley floor, creating a shimmering haze over the rocky terrain. The geography was chosen with surgical precision by the Mamluks. The valley was narrow, bordered by the steep slopes of the Gilboa Mountains, funneling any approaching army into a confined space. This negated the primary Mongol advantage of maneuverability. If the Mongols could be trapped here, they could not flank, they could not swarm. They would have to fight head-on. General Kitbuka, confident in his superiority, marched his 30,000 men into the valley. He saw what he expected to see: a small Mamluk force led by Baibars, seemingly isolated and vulnerable. It was the bait. Baibars, a warrior of immense physical stature and tactical cunning, engaged the Mongols in hit-and-run skirmishes. He would charge, loose arrows, and then pull back. To Kitbuka, this looked like weakness. It looked like the Mamluks were afraid to commit. The Mongols, smelling blood, began to push harder, driving deeper into the valley, stretching their lines, eager to crush this insolent resistance. For hours, Baibars played this dangerous game. He had to ensure the Mongols were fully committed, drawn deep into the jaws of the trap before the teeth came down. The dust kicked up by thousands of hooves obscured the sun. The air grew thick with the metallic scent of sweat and anticipation. And then, at the critical moment, Baibars signaled a final, desperate-looking retreat toward the highlands. Kitbuka took the bait. He ordered a full-scale charge, his entire army galloping forward to finish the job. It was then that the trap was sprung. From the wooded hills on either side of the valley, the main Mamluk army, hidden until this very second, revealed itself. The Mongols were surrounded on three sides. But being surrounded was not enough to defeat a Mongol army. They had fought their way out of worse situations before. The true shock was yet to come. As the Mamluk lines closed in, the special units deployed their secret weapon. Suddenly, the valley echoed with a series of deafening oars. The Midfa Corps ignited their hand cannons. Flashes of unnatural light ripped through the dust clouds. The noise was unlike anything the steppe ponies had ever heard. It wasn't the rhythmic beating of drums or the blowing of horns, it was the sharp, percussive crack of explosions. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The Mongol horses, usually so steady, were seized by a primal terror. They reared, bucked, and bolted. The meticulous formation of the Mongol cavalry, which relied on tight spacing and fluid movement, shattered. Riders were thrown to the ground. Lines of communication were severed by the din of the explosions and the panic of the animals. The smoke from the black powder drifted across the battlefield, a sulphurous fog that added to the confusion, stinging the eyes and choking the lungs. For the first time in generations, the Mongols were not the ones inducing terror. They were the ones experiencing it. The hunters had become the prey. The Mamluk heavy cavalry, seeing the disarray in the enemy ranks, charged. The impact was devastating. The Mongols, struggling to control their terrified mounts, could not execute their signature parry-and-shoot tactics. They were forced into a chaotic melee, a brutal close-quarters brawl where the heavier armor and curved scimitars of the Mamluks gave them the advantage. Kitbuka, realizing that his army was dissolving, tried to rally his men. He fought with the desperation of a man watching his world collapse. But the psychological blow had been too severe. The secret weapon had done its job. It hadn't killed all 30,000 men, the swords and lances would do that, but it had killed the idea of the Mongol army. It had stripped them of their coordination. The battle raged for hours. The Mongols, to their credit, did not break easily. They were the finest warriors on earth, and they fought with the ferocity of trapped tigers. At one point, they managed to push the Mamluk left wing back, threatening to break out of the encirclement. Sultan Qutuz, seeing his line waver, threw his helmet to the ground in a dramatic gesture of defiance, shouting, "O Islam!" and led a countercharge himself. This moment of leadership, combined with the continued disorientation caused by the gunpowder weapons and the enclosed terrain, sealed the Mongols' fate. By late afternoon, the invincible horde was broken. Those who weren't cut down in the valley floor tried to flee, only to be hunted down by the local villagers and the pursuing Mamluk light cavalry. Kitbuka was captured and executed. The entire Mongol expeditionary force, a terrifying army of 30,000 that had intended to march all the way to Morocco, was annihilated. The significance of this victory cannot be overstated. It was the first time a Mongol advance had been permanently halted. Before Ain Jalut, the Mongols had suffered minor defeats, but they had always returned with a larger army to exact revenge. This time, they did not. The myth of Mongol invincibility was shattered. The psychological spell that had paralyzed the world was broken. Nations realized that the horsemen from the east were men, not demons, and that they could be killed. The secret weapon used at Ain Jalut represents a pivotal moment in the history of military technology. While the Midfa hand cannons were primitive by later standards, inaccurate, slow to reload, and dangerous to the user, their deployment marked the beginning of the end for the age of the horse archer. It was the dawn of the age of gunpowder. The Mamluks had correctly identified that the strength of the Mongol army lay in the biological partnership between man and horse, and they used chemistry to sever that bond. It is fascinating to consider the irony. The Mongols, who had facilitated the trade routes that brought gunpowder from China to the Middle East, were ultimately defeated by a weaponization of that very trade. They had carried the seeds of their own destruction in their saddlebags. The aftermath of the battle reshaped the map of the world. The Mamluk Sultanate solidified its control over Egypt and the Levant, becoming the guardians of the holy cities and the premier power in the Islamic world for centuries. The Mongols, facing internal succession crises and realizing the limits of their expansion, never again seriously threatened Cairo. The Euphrates River became a border, a high-water mark where the tidal wave finally broke. But beyond the geopolitics, this story of this battle is a testament to human ingenuity and the refusal to accept the inevitable. When the entire world had resigned itself to the Mongol yoke, a group of former slaves looked at the approaching storm and decided to engineer a solution. They didn't just pray for a miracle, they built one. They took the raw elements of the earth, charcoal, sulfur, saltpeter, and forged a weapon that could challenge the most powerful military force the world had ever seen. The destruction of the 30,000 Mongols at Ain Jalut was not just a military victory, it was a psychological revolution. It proved that technology, tactics, and the audacious application of new ideas could overcome overwhelming odds. The smoke that cleared over the Jezreel Valley that day revealed a new world order, one where the mounted archer would eventually give way to the musketeer, and where the terror of the horde was replaced by the terrifying potential of gunpowder. As we look back on this event, it serves as a reminder that history is rarely a straight line. It is a series of collisions, often decided by the side that can adapt the fastest. The Mongols were masters of the past, perfecting the ancient art of steppe warfare to its absolute peak. The Mamluks, however, were looking to the future. In the hands of a Mamluk soldier, a crude tube filled with black powder was more than just a weapon, it was a declaration that the rules of war had changed. The silence that fell over the valley of Ain Jalut after the slaughter was heavy. The river of history had shifted its course. The seemingly eternal expansion of the Mongol Empire had hit a wall of fire and iron, and while the Midfa would evolve into the muskets and cannons that would shape the next 500 years of human conflict, its debut on that dusty afternoon in Galilee remains one of the most dramatic turning points in the saga of human warfare. The secret weapon had done its work. The 30,000 were gone, and the world would never be the same again. To fully grasp the depth of this tactical revolution, we must scrutinize the sheer audacity required to deploy such untested technology in a battle for survival. Imagine the Mamluk commanders, Qutuz and Baybars, in the war room. They are not merely planning a defense, they are banking the survival of their civilization on a powder that, until recently, was a curiosity for court magicians. This was high-stakes gambling of the highest order. If the powder failed to ignite, or if the noise failed to spook the horses, the Mamluks would have been encircled and butchered just like the armies of Poland-Hungary and China before them. The preparation for this ambush involved more than just chemistry. It required immense discipline from the Mamluk soldiers themselves, to hold fire, to wait until the enemy was deep within the killing zone, to stand firm while 30,000 screaming warriors thundered toward you. This required nerves of steel. The Mamluk Trainen, G Regimen, Thefurusia, emphasized not just martial skills but spiritual and mental fortitude. They were taught that their lives belonged to the Sultan and to God. This indoctrination allowed them to stand their ground in the face of the Mongol terror, where other armies had fled before the first arrow was loosed. Furthermore, the intelligence network of the Mamluks played a crucial role. They knew Kitbuka. They knew his arrogance. They understood that a Mongol general, accustomed to decades of unbroken victories, would view a retreat not as a tactic, but as the natural order of things. The feigned retreat was the oldest trick in the Mongol playbook, yet Kitbuka fell for it when it was used against him. Why? Because of confirmation bias. He believed the Mamluks were terrified because everyone was terrified. He saw what he wanted to see. Baybars exploited this psychological blind spot masterfully. The battle also highlights the limitations of the Mongol system. The Mongols were a logistical miracle, capable of moving vast armies across continents, living off the land and the milk of their mares. But they were rigid in their tactical doctrine. They had a system that worked, and they rarely deviated from it because they rarely needed to. When faced with an out-of-context problem, the explosions, the noise, the enclosed terrain, they failed to adapt in real time. Their command structure, usually so fluid, became brittle under the shock of the new. As the sun set on Ain Jalut, the carnage was absolute. The accounts of the time describe pyramids of skulls and the complete disintegration of the invading force. But the legacy of the battle wasn't just in the body count, it was in the preservation of culture. Had the Mongols conquered Egypt, the cultural heritage of the Islamic Golden Age, which had already been dealt a severe blow in Baghdad, might have been extinguished entirely. Cairo became the lifeboat of this civilization. Scholars, artists, and scientists flocked to the Mamluk court, safe behind the shield that had been forged in the Galilee. The secret weapon, therefore, was not just a tool of destruction, but a tool of preservation. It shielded the flame of knowledge from the winds of the steppe. It allowed the Mamluk architecture to rise, the madrasas to flourish, and the trade routes to remain open. In the centuries that followed, the story of Ain Jalut became legend. It was told and retold in the coffee houses of Cairo and Damascus. The details were often embellished. The explosions became louder, the fire brighter. But the core truth remained: this was the day the dragon was slain. The Midfa hand cannon eventually evolved. The wooden tubes became bronze, the bamboo became iron. The inaccuracy was refined into precision. The weapon that spooked the horses at Ain Jalut would eventually bring down the walls of feudal castles and end the era of the armored knight. But in 1260 it was just a spark, a flash in the pan, a desperate experiment by men with their backs to the wall. It serves as a profound lesson in asymmetry. You do not need to match your enemy's strength, you only need to attack their weakness. The Mongols were strong in speed, strong in archery, and strong in terror. They were weak against the unknown. The Mamluks introduced the unknown into the equation, and the result was total victory. The narrative of the secret weapon that destroyed 30,000 Mongols is a story of the collision between the past and the future. It is a story about the moment when the biological warfare of the steppe, the horse and the bow, met the chemical warfare of the modern age. It was a violent, bloody, and chaotic birth for the era of gunpowder, but it was a birth nonetheless. And as the dust settled and the Mamluks collected the spoils of war, wiping the black soot from their hands, they likely didn't realize the full scope of what they had unleashed. They had just wanted to save their kingdom. In doing so, they had rewritten the future of warfare. The invincibility of the Mongol Empire died not with a whimper, but with a bang, a literal bang, echoing off the rocky walls of the Jezreel Valley, signaling to the world that even the gods of war can bleed.